As we make our way through horror history, we can't go far without visiting one of the genre's most influential artists, the one and only David Cronenberg. With so many classics in his repertoire to choose from, it was hard to know where to start, so I picked what fans and critics consider his most accessible and celebrated film, one that showcases the hybrid of existential and biological sci-fi horror that became his trademark throughout the 70s and 80s. As with all our deconstructing episodes, we're going to explore this classic film in 3 parts. Origin, in which we trace the film back to its roots as a short story and 1958 film adaptation. Legacy, where I'll examine the film's impact on popular culture and its place in the golden age of 80s horror. And Mystery, where I'll dig into some lesser-known facts, creepy trivia, and some interesting interpretations of the story. So prepare to take a dive into the plasma pool as we deconstruct David Cronenberg's legendary sci-fi horror classic, The Fly. While the original film is considered a classic by many fans, it hasn't aged that well. Although it stays true to the original short story, it plays fast and loose with the rules of science, even for the 50s. During the peak of the 80s horror boom, The Fly seemed like the ideal story for a high-concept remake. Producer Stuart Kornfeld pitched the concept to the execs at Fox, who then hired screenwriter Charles Edward Pogue to write the first draft. Unfortunately, the studio didn't like what he wrote, but they made a deal with Kornfeld to distribute the film if he could finance it himself. Enter a second producer, Mel Brooks. Yes, that Mel Brooks.
May the Schwartz be with you.
Brooks liked the concept, and after a couple of rewrites, went searching for a director. David Cronenberg was Brooks' first choice based on his reputation for shocking cerebral body horror like Videodrome. But Cronenberg had a prior commitment. He was preparing to direct Total Recall. As you probably know, that version fell through, and a couple years later the gig went to Paul Verhoeven. But it freed up Cronenberg to direct The Fly, on the condition he'd be allowed to rewrite the script to fit his distinctive personal style. He also changed the character dynamics from a husband and wife relationship to the early days of a new romance, including the sexual aspects of that theme. Although they weren't the studio's first choices, Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis were ideal for the lead roles of Seth and Veronica. Not only did they have uniquely quirky personalities, their real-life relationship created natural on-screen chemistry. Cronenberg also made a perfect choice in hiring Chris Walas and his team to design The Fly's extensive and gruesome special effects, which would eventually win the film an Oscar. Had the Academy been more open to horror films back then, I'm sure it would have taken home even more. The Fly is also the biggest hit of Cronenberg's filmmaking career, and it quickly established itself as an icon of modern culture. Its legendary tagline, conceived by Mel Brooks and delivered by Gina Davis,
"Be afraid. Be very afraid,"
became a popular catchphrase around the world, and it's still used today. The movie itself is name-checked in countless TV shows, from Saturday Night Live to The Simpsons and Rick and Morty. Thankfully, no one has managed to fully develop a remake, at least not yet. But of course, there was a 1989 sequel directed by Chris Walas himself, who loaded it with some impressive monster effects and buckets of gore and slime. It's gruesome fun, but lacks the dramatic power of its predecessor. Oddly enough, Cronenberg did adapt the film for another medium. In 2008, he directed an opera based on the screenplay. It was really a natural fit since Cronenberg felt the material was already operatic in scope. You can even feel it in the film's epic score by legendary composer Howard Shore. Attempts to develop a second sequel have also fallen through, at least on the screen. But the comic book series The Fly Outbreak is considered canon by fans of the film, and it picks up where The Fly 2 left off, continuing the story of Seth and Veronica's son Martin. One of the more shocking rumors about the film turned out to be absolutely true. The first preview audience was so horrified by one particular scene that it was immediately cut from the final version. In this scene, Brundlefly tries desperately to reverse his horrific metamorphosis by splicing the genetic patterns of 2 animals, a second baboon and an ordinary cat. The result is disturbing enough, but it's Brundle's reaction that shocked audiences beyond their limits. They also hated an epilogue following the death of Brundlefly that revealed Veronica giving birth to a seemingly normal baby, which then sprouts a set of butterfly wings. Cronenberg didn't like it either because it ruined the dramatic punch of Seth Brundle's death, but he kept an earlier dream sequence which featured another kind of offspring. Cronenberg himself plays the obstetrician in this nightmare at Gina Davis's personal request. The director says he doesn't like doing cameos in his own films, but he has no problem appearing in other people's projects. In fact, he can be found in front of the camera more often than behind it these days. There really was a song written for the movie called Help Me by Brian Ferry and Nile Rodgers, but you'll have to listen closely to hear it. The track was originally meant to play under the closing credits, and Cronenberg loved it, but it conflicted with the somber mood of the ending. Instead, he shifted it to the bar scene where it's playing in the background just barely. This is a minor point, but since Cronenberg wanted the science of the fly to seem as realistic as possible, it's worth mentioning. Seth says the computer got confused when it found the fly's genetic pattern in the pod with him. But what about the trillions of microorganisms that already live in the human body? Gut bacteria, mites, and other creatures outnumber our own cells by 10 to 1. So why didn't Seth turn into E. coli man or a walking, talking eyelash mite? One fan theory suggests that Seth took those microscopic organisms into account when he taught the computer about the nature of the flesh. If he's truly a genius, something that important wouldn't just slip by him. But still, that doesn't explain why he didn't take better precautions against contamination before jumping butt naked into the pod. I'll let you figure out that one for yourself. And I'd also love to hear your own theories and interpretations of The Fly. Let us know in the comments and tell us what you'd like to see deconstructed next. And be sure to like this channel and ring the little bell to get updates on all our horror content. Don't be afraid.
The Thing is a 1982 horror film brought to us by master of horror John Carpenter. Carpenter was coming off 3 straight profitable and critically approved movies with Halloween, The Fog, and Escape from New York when he was given a huge budget for his first true studio project. Carpenter's name had been involved since the mid-1970s, even though he only had his student film Dark Star to his credit. Universal balked at that and wanted Tobe Hooper and his writing partner Kim Henkel to get a go at crafting the film, but eventually they lost out as the studio wasn't a fan of their approach. Eventually it fell back to Carpenter, but with a larger focus on the original source material rather than remaking the Howard Hawks produced 1951 original. This was seen as kismet as Carpenter was a huge fan of Hawks and even modeled his siege film Assault on Precinct 13 on Hawks' own Rio Bravo. Bill Lancaster would be brought in to do the script, even as Carpenter and longtime friend Kurt Russell helped add ideas to it. Carpenter also brought his frequent collaborator Dean Cundey to shoot the film, and instead of writing the score himself, which he usually does, these duties fell to Italian legend Ennio Morricone, who would later win an Academy Award for The Hateful Eight with unused and remixed sections of his own score for this movie. The cast was incredible in the film, but nearly none of them were the first options. Kurt Russell, in fact, was the last person to be cast, with Universal throwing out names like Christopher Walken, Jeff Bridges, and Tom Atkins. McCready wasn't the only character with lots of options, though. Childs was almost played by Bernie Casey, Carl Weathers, and even Isaac Hayes, with Ernie Hudson being a frontrunner until Keith David was eventually cast. Palmer was seen as the comedy relief, so the studio naturally sought after Jay Leno, Gary Shandling, and Roger Rabbit himself, Charles Fleischer, but ultimately David Clennon won the role over with his ability to play the serious notes a little bit better. Finally, Gary, the leader of this very different cast of men, was almost played by Jerry Orbach, Lee Van Cleef, and Powers Booth before Donald Moffat eventually became the station's commander. With the cast in place, filming began on August 24th, 1981, with a budget that would eventually reach $15 million, a high for a John Carpenter film, and his first big studio effort. The film would release on June 25th, 1982, and would eventually gross over $19 million.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
While the film generally has the reputation of being a massive flop, the truth is it was neither a flop nor a hit, even if it was still a disappointment. Who Goes There was written by John W. Campbell Jr. and was published in 1938 in the collection Astounding Stories. Campbell used the pen name Don A. Stewart for its first run. It was also listed under the alternate title The Thing from Another World, which would be used in the story's first adaptation in 1951. Campbell's career spanned from 1930 with the publication of numerous short stories and would run all the way up to his death in 1971. He released 8 novels, with his first coming in 1933 with Beyond the End of Space, and his last one in 1966 with The Ultimate Weapon. He was a skilled editor during his entire career, with some claiming him to be science fiction's greatest editor, including for Isaac Asimov. In addition to the main 8 novels, Campbell would release 4 short story collections from 1948 to 1966, with an additional 4 coming post-mortem. Discussing Campbell the man is a little more complicated. While not as well known to be the horrifyingly menacing racist that H.P. Lovecraft was, Campbell had a lot of outwardly awful thoughts on slavery, even going on record saying that it gave them a better life than they had in Africa. Woof. He also had no sympathy for the Watts rioters and argued to keep schools segregated because, well, honestly, I don't even want to type it out or say it, but go look him up if you need the exact details. In addition to those lovely thoughts, he was not exactly a believer in most medicines and argued that there was absolutely no way to tie smoking to any kind of illnesses. Sure. He would also take his own genre a bit too serious and believed in pseudoscience, including something called a Dean drive that would go against the known laws of physics. Okay, so this is definitely a case of separating the art from the artist. He would live to see the 1951 movie adaptation, but no others, nor would he see his fully realized version be published, but more on those later. So now let's get into the actual adaptation. How did Carpenter and team do? Well, the story opens up at Big Magnet Research Complex in Antarctica at the tail end of winter. The 37 men stationed at the Big Magnet stumble across a spaceship that has been buried in the ice for millions of years. When they try to excavate it with a thermal charge, basically the equivalent to fishing with dynamite, the ship itself is destroyed, but they do come across at least one of the crew members who was frozen in the ice while they surmise it was looking for heat. The movie, on the other hand, opens with the now infamous crazy Swedes in a helicopter trying to kill a dog that looks to seek shelter at US Outpost number 31 in the first week of winter, a station that now only has a total of 12 men. One of the later to be found out Norwegian men blows up his own helicopter, while the other one continues to shoot after the dog until the head of the base, Gary, deposits a bullet into his brain. The dog handler, Clark, takes the dog inside to help it as they patch up researcher Bennings, who was shot in the leg by the rifle-toting Norwegian. The group discovers that there's a camp where the 2 men must have come from and send Doc Copper and chopper pilot McCready to investigate. They find mostly destroyed ruins, some bodies, a huge square chunk of ice, and finally burned remains that they can't identify. So, if you're keeping track so far, the differences include the names of the stations, the number of inhabitants, how they discovered the thing in the first place, the Norwegian camp, existing, and then some of the characters are different. McCready is second in command, not a pilot, and a lot of the characters, although the names are the same, are very different from book to film. The alien in the book thaws out, virtually bringing it back to life, and it kills and reproduces an imitation of one of the researchers named Conant. It attempts to do the same thing with the sled dogs of the compound before it's caught by the remaining scientists and killed before it can complete its replication of the dogs. One of the scientists named Blair goes insane from paranoia and guilt, as he was the one that pushed hard for the creature to thaw out in the first place, and he's locked in a cabin as to not put anyone else in danger, something he absolutely threatens to do. Finally, they opt as a team to destroy their own vehicles and not raise any alarms on the radio as to get a search party or rescue team sent after them. The men of the film find the new dog they took in attempting to kill and absorb the other dogs, but stop it with straight up bullets and eventually a flamethrower. The first remains had normal sets of human organs, and these remains are found to be able to perfectly replicate any cellular organism they want. It's here in the film that 3 of the men go to the crash site of an alien ship that they found with the notes and the tapes of the Norwegian camp. Movie Blair runs a simulation and finds that all of Earth is at risk if this still alive creature makes it to civilization. He goes a little crazy and kills the remaining dogs, as well as makes all the vehicles and radios inoperable before he's put into isolation. Blair in both mediums is the one that goes a little nutty first and is isolated in both, but while the story has a suspicious member immediately after, the movie characters suspect nothing. The creature of the book also begins its assimilations by devouring its victim, while the movie counterpart seems to dissolve its prey. The other stark difference is Movie Blair taking matters into his own hands, while the men of the book come to the decision as a group to isolate the base with no means of escape. Back to the book team, who now decides they have to figure out how to find out how many of them are compromised by the alien creature, now being known as the eponymous thing. They decide a blood test can discern who is and isn't human, but when they attempt to test it on a sled dog, they're surprised to find that both human and alien blood were used in the test, which tells them that either the doctor or the commander is actually already gone. McCready, here the assistant commander at the base rather than a pilot, takes command and they electrocute and burn the remaining animals on the base. The first on-screen assimilation is when Bennings is alone with the burnt remains and is burned before he can finish the job. The group now begins to worry how many others have been turned, and a blood test is suggested, but fails when they find the uncontaminated blood has been destroyed. The group knows it can only have been Commander Gary or Doc Copper, and after an argument and the radio man Windows running off to get a gun in self-defense, they change leadership. Norris is suggested, but MacReady is eventually chosen as the new leader. Fuchs, who has taken over Blair's duties, wanders off after someone cuts the lights in the lab, and his burnt remains are eventually found. Knowles and MacReady go to investigate MacReady's shack, but Knowles comes back alone with torn clothes of MacReady's, and the team decides that he must have been taken over. Even as they attempt to keep him out, MacReady breaks through a storage window and Norris has a heart attack during the altercation. Copper tries to use a defibrillator on Norris, only for his body to open up and his transformation kill the doctor. MacReady burns the body and then watches the head try to escape on its own until he burns that too. While who takes over is eventually the same, many of the events are different, drastically so in the movie with the amount of action and death that takes place compared to the book at this point. The men of Big Magnet are going mad with paranoia and trust is at an all-time low. This leads to the cook named Kinner being murdered, but also to have shown to have already been assimilated. MacReady figures out that any part of the Thing organism will be its own entity and uses a heated up wire to test the blood of each man one at a time. A staggering 14 of them prove to have been infected as they brutally beat them to death and rip them apart. The book goes out of its way to say how sadistic this is, as even though the men have makeshift blowtorches and electrical rods, they use their hands to rip these things apart. These guys end up enjoying this aspect of it. The remaining men now know they have to go test the isolated Blair and find not him, but what the alien is in its natural form. A blue humanoid creature with 3 red eyes and worm-like hair. The creature was able to squeeze under the door and therefore move around the camp at will. It had built a gravity-defying backpack it was going to use to leap across the ocean and infect civilization at large, but it's killed when MacReady lures it out of the shack and burns it with a blowtorch fashioned into a flamethrower. The men realize in horror just how close it was to being done and ready to leave. Movie MacReady also figures out that each cell of this organism is its own entity and also uses the exact same test method by using a hot wire to test the collected blood. He's attacked by Clark, who he shoots and kills, but unlike the book, Clark turns out to be human. The book has 14 members turn, including Gary, who they suspected, but here it's only Palmer who changes and kills Windows before being destroyed. This event leaves only Childs, MacReady, Knowles, and Gary to go test Blair. They go to test him to find out he's been turned at some point, but he isn't there, only a spaceship that he was building to escape, which the men obviously blow up. Power's knocked out in the camp, and the men realize the Thing wants to freeze and be rescued eventually, so they blow up the remaining camp until they're underground where the power generator is. Knowles dies or is assimilated off screen, and we see Gary killed directly by Blair Thing, who is stalking him in human form. It changes into a mass of everything you can think of, but MacReady is able to blow it up before finding a wandering Childs. The two men share a drink and wait to see what happens. The endings of both mediums are drastically different, with only 2 survivors in the film, 14 men changing during the book test, and the means in which the Thing wants to escape. Other differences throughout include the Thing being discovered to be telepathic in the book, it having an actual form instead of the movie always having it mid-transformation or already assimilated, and characters being mostly similar in name only. So, which one is better and what are their legacies? I'd say that objectively the film is better. It takes all the main themes of the book with isolation, paranoia, and the main crux of the monster being able to assimilate creatures, but gives it much better characters and some of the greatest special effects ever put to screen. Carpenter, Cundy, Morricone, and the actors all being masters of their craft outweigh Campbell being an admittedly great writer and editor, but ultimately an awful human being. The story was adapted 3 times technically, with 1951's The Thing from Another World, 1972's Horror Express, yeah, really, look it up, and of course today's film. The film would get a prequel, but since it's based on the Norwegian camp that doesn't exist in the novella, it doesn't count as an adaptation. The full manuscript and extended version of Who Goes There, Frozen Hell, was published in 2019. The 1982 movie has had a much larger impact than the first 2 adaptations, even with the Howard Hawks production being considered a 50s-era sci-fi classic. It was adapted in sequel form with a 2002 video game, had the aforementioned prequel, had awesome toys created for it, a short line of comic books, and even had its own movie novelization written by Alan Dean Foster and released in 1982 along with the movie. Foster used Lancaster's original script as the film wasn't completed in time and had a lot of fun differences. Fuchs is killed by the Thing with an axe instead of burning. Doc and Mac find tapes at the Norwegian camp to tell the whole story. Bennings, MacReady, and Childs chase the dogs who have all become things to kill them, only to have Bennings die in the battle. Windows is actually named Sanders. Copper survives the Norris thing only to be killed by the Palmer thing, and the ending is radically different. I won't spoil exactly what that is if you choose to seek it out, but I highly recommend you do. While the adaptation isn't the closest to the source material, we were given one of the greatest horror movies of all time by simply using the basic outline and underlying fears generated by the book. Have you read any version of the novella? Which is your favorite version of the thing? Let us know in the comments.
Although I firmly believe remakes should be saved for great ideas that end up being subpar work, listen, I won't deny that every once in a while someone turns in something great. Today I'd like to look back at one of the early remakes of the 2000s remake boom to get it right. One that found a way to bring the original story into the more cynical mindset of 2004, while never looking down on the original material, something that, seems to happen more and more nowadays, but back then was quite rare. If there was one that was destined to fail, it was Dawn of the Dead, yet it didn't. Hell, it just about surprised all of us in 2004, and though it doesn't surpass Romero's original, culturally that's nigh impossible. What we got was a wild, gory, and intense ride that showed off the directing skills of a then music video director Zack Snyder and a mostly trauma writer by the name of James Gunn. So let's get into why Dawn of the Dead works and the scene that defines it. It's wild to look back at the remake boom, far removed from the anger and passion, to see a lot of, let's be honest, safe, stale, middle-of-the-road entries. It's almost cute how mad we got. Man, who would have thought that the Legacy sequel would end up being worse than these remakes? Time's a funny thing, huh? Picking up in the late 90s and peaking mid to late 2000s, we had some... And one of the biggest surprises was Dawn of the Dead.
Also that we can sail off into the sunset on this asshole's boat?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in.
Dawn 04 took the style of hyper-violence, fast editing, and artistic directing and filtered it through a 1970s story. And yes, credit must be given to 28 Days Later. And yes, again, I know they weren't actually traditional zombies, but people infected with the rage virus. But Dawn made it the trend that it eventually turned into. And Snyder's directing flares really made it pop. Not the slow burn meditation of the original, Dawn 04 is a modern action movie aesthetic, telling a horror tale. And so the defining scene is one that represents a style and tone. Now there are a few great scenes that could have been decent discussions, but to me, the opening is the pure batshit crazy energy that Dawn 04 adapted. It's a tad more cliched now, but this 0 to 60 opening was something special to see in theaters. Dude, I was there opening weekend, crowd went nuts, we had claps, cheers, it was something. It is the perfect tone setter, one that establishes the threat, the severity, and urgency. Sarah Polley plays Anna Clark, a nurse coming home after a long double. We get some dialogue about reports of a patient that may have turned for the worse. Another was wheeled quickly past with a neck wound. But of course, it's just another day in the office for Anna. We set up a fake out with the ambulance driver asleep and the doors open. It's a little tension build.
It's starting early.
As the hammer is coming, but we're just not sure exactly when. Anna's doing her normal commute, and it's here Snyder gives us the overhead sprawling subdivision shot. Everyday America. Houses look the same, for the sake of unity, never-ending streets, it's a maze. We are in the Midwest, folks. She eventually makes it home to the hubby, played by Louis Ferreira. After some catching up and some shower sex, she heads in for the night to get some actual rest. Of course, during their water play, they both missed the emergency broadcast bulletin, setting up the beginning of humanity's end, and our main characters don't have a single clue. I know it's quick, but it is surprisingly restrained for what becomes a roller coaster type of action horror movie. Calm with a sense of dread, eye of the storm type of thing. And then Vivian, a neighborhood kid, walks in full zombie, and the adrenaline goes full blast. The reasons fast zombies work for the modern audience is it's pretty much hopeless. Yes, outside of plot armor, a full sprinting infectious carnivore that feels no pain is an apex predator. We are dead, no hope, no redemption, f***ing dead. The rose-colored glasses had worn thin, I suppose, and as a country, especially at that time, it's how we all felt. The thrill of Lewis being killed by a kid and Anna losing the love of her life to be immediately put in danger, barely escaping from Lewis in the bathroom. And let's talk about this great overhead stunt move that feels like it hurts. Now let's look at it again, especially the head. It's a stressful scene with Anna making it out the window just in time for the big reveal. The zombie outbreak is here. We take for granted a moment like this. I mean, hell, the whole scene really, since we've seen similar things in the following years, but the madness of complete chaos was something else. The neighbor willing to kill, and for an out-of-control ambulance to take him out was cool, man. Snyder deserves credit, along with editor Niven Howie, for crafting such a dynamic escape. Anna finds safety in her car, and as she tries to exit the subdivision, we see her small suburb world burning. We're experiencing the onslaught of information as Anna does. I love this locked-on trunk shot as she tries to sort of exit. And if you've ever experienced the maze-like infrastructure of a subdivision, you get why this shot works. It's turn after turn after turn. To then go wide, kind of similar to before. Now witnessing the destruction and its far reach. The zoom into the gas station explosion is so over the top. I love it. Full on action here, folks. But here is the real sell. After everything, Anna crashes her car and gets knocked out. We cut to the title card. Some bigwig at the CDC is going through the actual process of what would happen if all of this was real. Lack of concrete information and the final acknowledgement of complete ignorance. Cut to news flashes of the world ending, scored to the tune of Johnny Cash, "The Man Comes Round." As the lyrics reference Revelations, news clip after news clip, we see the end. This is one of the most perfectly tone-setting openings. Cool, tense, and surprisingly poetic. There is something haunting about the line delivery of, "We don't know."
We don't know.
Leading into the song.
When the man comes around.
God damn, that is how you open a movie. Dawn of the Dead turns 20 years old this year. This is a 20-year-old movie. Man, the sands of time are quick, the lessons of life silent, and if you don't slow down and take in the view, then the ride is nothing more than filler.
Say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride.
I aged 2 decades in hearing that this new movie is now factually old. But I've always had a blast with it. Zack Snyder was a great choice for a stylistic heavy movie. And while the remake may have not have been the sole factor, it absolutely played a role in shaping the direction of zombie films and influencing the evolution of the genre for a long time afterwards. If you haven't seen this in a while, it is still a blast. A tad goofy and over the top, but it fulfills the most important requirement for a movie of its type. It's a damn good time.
Is it a virus?
We don't know.
How does it spread? Is it airborne?
Airborne is a possibility. We don't know.
Is this a health hazard or a military concern?
Both.
Are these people alive or dead?
We don't know.
Seems like the world is moving on. Didn't stop, look around. Didn't give a shit if you're crashing down. You can close your eyes but not your skin. Don't believe what you refuse to see. Won't find a way in. But I can't ignore the certain fate. The result of people finding everything. Paint you and then paint you and then leave you with nothing but a burnt out soul. They say it's better face to face. How can you stop the avalanche of the human race?